Well, welcome to today's session. Our focus today will be valuing on equal spaces. Unequal spaces. Again, like the prior sessions, I'm going through each of these sessions brick by brick. And so one of the best ways to really understand and appreciate some of the ideas will be to begin from the bottom, from the first session, and work your way upwards. So I'm going to be continuing from where I stopped in the prior session. The focus or the idea today will be to try and draw some attention to how you go about valuing a building with spaces that do not have the same value. Maybe perhaps I should have begun by making a statement. The statement is that not all spaces in a building are valued equally. Let me say that again. Not all spaces in a building are valued equally. The reason for that is because certain parts of a building have what we call a premium use value, and other parts have a limited use value. So when you have a building which has a limited use value, it would be wrong of you to associate the same price or the same intrinsic value or the same reconstruction cost. And therefore, there is some level of adjustments that needs to be carried out to ensure that you are not overpaying for the property. I will use an example. What you see here is the front elevation of a building. If you would forgive me, let me try and annotate the side elevation. Same building, but the side elevation. But in this case, I'm doing something different. What you see here in this section is what we call the original architecture, the original construction. What you see here is an extension. So if you have a building, and let's say this building has a window on that level and a window on that level. This is a Victorian building in this case, and normally the stairs will be on that side of the house, hence you have the windows to bring in natural light. How do you value both buildings? Well, rather, how do you value this building, assuming both are one building? But in addition to that, let's assume that in addition to this extension, that this particular building, or let's say building one, perhaps that's the best way to do this. Let's put a different building, a completely different building. But this time around, this building has been separated into individual units. This is a single home, and this call it 3 flats. Ground floor, first floor, and then in this case, let's say that the loft has been converted. Again, this is the side elevation, front elevation. The loft has been extended, and this has been extended to create a 1-bedroom flat. On the first floor you have a 2-bedroom flat. On the ground floor you have a 2-bedroom flat. In this case you might be buying the freehold. In this case you will be buying the leasehold, or a part of the freehold. But here are 2 different examples. And what I'd like to do today is just give you an overview of how you should value what I call unequal spaces. For this building, looking at the first floor and the ground floor, the loft apartment cannot be of the same value as the lower floors. And I will explain why that is the case. Similarly, for building 1, where you have an extension to the ground floor, it cannot be given the same value as the original architecture. And again, I will try to provide some explanation. But let me set the scene. If you recall, in one of the prior sessions, I talked about the different types of period buildings. And I said that in the UK, a lot of the period buildings we have are associated with a particular era, a particular time. And the timing coincided and was named after a monarch, a period of monarchy where the buildings or the architectural style or the period types were named after the monarchy. For example, you have Georgian buildings which were named after King George, Victorian buildings which was named after Queen Victoria, Edwardian buildings which was named after King Edward. What you're looking at here is the Edwardian era, the Victorian time, the Georgian monarchy period, and you can even keep going back. The Regency, Smith and Mary, Tudor, the Elizabethan. And what you find is in Georgian buildings, and let me start with, I guess that, in Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian buildings, usually the ground floor was designed as the main floor for the guests, with the first floor used as the main bedrooms. Now there was an exception, and the exception to this are some Georgian townhouses where the first floor was designed as the main guest floor. But in any case, what you find in most period buildings is that the floor to ceiling heights, the floor heights, and the volume of the spaces were vastly larger and grander in comparison to the upper floors. They were just more grand. They were designed to be for entertaining guests, and therefore a lot more attention was paid to the spaces. The quality of the fireplaces, the positions and the size of the windows, the ceiling height, the corniche design and detailing on the ceilings, the level of attention to detail in the door handles, the types of doors, everything was designed to be quite impressive. As a result of that, you would find that in most buildings in the UK, I'll use London more specifically, ground floor apartments, first floor apartments in period buildings, again I'm referring to period buildings, tend to have more of a wow factor. The upper floors were usually meant to be used by guests or servants. In some buildings, you also had lower ground floors. Lower ground floors were used for kitchen areas or storage areas. So what you'd find, there are some parts of the UK where you have lower ground floors that have been converted to flats. Those floors were originally meant to be storage and kitchen areas, but they have been converted to flats because of the shortage of available apartments and housing in the capital city. The lofts have also been converted to dwellings, again because of the shortage of available housing. However, if you're buying one of these properties, or if you're buying an entire property that has had an extension, a renovation, a conversion, it's important to keep in mind that the value of the prime spaces cannot be the same as the value of the non-prime or limited use spaces, lower ground and loft. Put it in other terms, the ground floor, the first floor, should have a higher value. Conversely, you should pay a lower price for period buildings with modern extensions. And I'm referring to this now, and the reason is because extensions to a property cost much less to construct than the price that the property is marketed for. Let me put this in more of a simple way to understand. Let's assume you found a property and it was on the market for, and it's an entire house. It's on the market for $1,500,000. If the property is 200 square meters, then in principle, on a pricing basis, it means that the property is going for £7,500 per square meter, because you've accounted for the entire floor area. If, on the other hand, the extension is 20 square meter, if you were to go to the market and you found a property that was in its original state and you were going to pay a contractor to do an extension of 20 square meters, the contractor would charge you sometimes in the region of about 1,800 to 2,300 per meter square. Therefore, if you're not careful, sometimes you could be paying between 200 to 300 as a premium, because when the property was marketed, it was marketed based on a combination of the premium space and the limited or the extended space. So the purpose of this session today is just to draw your attention to the uniqueness that several buildings do have, which is part of the reason I recommended in the early sessions that you always have to go to the rear part of the building so that you can look from the rear to see what extensions have been done. It's also important to look from the front to see what extensions have been done. Typically, if the loft has been converted, you would see roof lights. Not always. For new buildings, these are designed in. For existing buildings, you will see roof lights. But sometimes you may not see any roof lights because the extension is obvious from the rear part of the building or from the side. So keep that in mind. Due to the need in Great Britain and in the rest of the United Kingdom for additional homes, especially in the major cities, London, Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, Bath, Bristol, and in the smaller cities such as Bath and Bristol, where there is still a huge demand for housing, many buildings have now been converted from the original architecture and certain parts of the building have been extended to do two things: to maximize the floor area or to provide multiple demises, multiple dwellings. As such, if you are buying a property, whether you're buying a freehold or whether you're buying a leasehold, or whether you're buying a leasehold plus a part of the freehold, or whether you're buying a common hold, one of the things you should do is to ascertain if it is an original architecture or an original building that you're buying, or if the building you're buying has been modified. This would be a modified building once the extension has been constructed. But if the building was kept in its original state, then it would be an original architecture. This would also be a modified building. So your responsibility is to ascertain, has the building been modified or is it in its original architecture? Now, failure to do so, like I just explained, could mean that you could be paying more in price than you will receive in value. And if you did that, if you paid a premium, that means you're automatically transferring your wealth to the buyer. Again, this occurs mainly in properties with lower ground or ground floor extension. Lower ground, ground floor extension, or loft conversions. Loft conversions could cost between 1,007 and 3,000 pounds per square meter on average. Or rather, I could even say on the aggregate. But these properties, once they've been converted, they'll be sold at 200 to 300% of the build cost. One of the reasons it's easy to sell is because when you walk into the property, and if you walked into the building without inspecting the external envelope in detail, what you see is a building that has been very beautifully decorated internally. Except you are a building professional, except you are a builder, an architect, an engineer, an interior designer, it may be very difficult to spot the difference within the building between what has been extended and what is original. So you need to rely on your ability to inspect from the outside. As a buyer, again, you need to pay close attention to the value of the spaces you're paying for. And where necessary, you should be willing to adjust, making the necessary adjustments to the sale price to ensure that you're not transferring your wealth to that of the to the seller. That said, let me give you a good example of something that I encountered. Some time ago, I viewed a one-bedroom flat in London. It was on the market for £325,000. The brochure that was provided by the agent described the property as a Victorian building, a first floor Victorian building. And it provided a floor area of 65 square meters. That automatically indicated to me that perhaps this was an attractive opportunity based on the price per square meter. So that intrigued me, and I said I'd like to see the property. Obviously, I did my due diligence in advance. I went on Google Maps and Street View, and I could see the property. I did my aerial view, my satellite view, but from the satellite view, I could not see exactly in detail all of the extensions, because sometimes from the satellite view you could see properties that have actually had roof extensions or ground floor extensions or first floor extensions, but I couldn't determine that from the Google satellite view. So I arranged to view the property. Upon arrival, what I observed was the property in fact, imagine this to be the first floor. The property, and imagine this to be the roof. What had happened was, as you walked into the property, there was a stairs that took you up, and it was a loft conversion. As soon as I walked in, I realized there was a loft conversion. I also observed that the flat had a very, in terms of the floor area, it was disproportionately, the space was disproportionately in the loft converted space as opposed to the original space. What I surmised was that this was a studio. This was a studio flat on the first floor, and the owner had obtained planning permission to extend the loft. And by extending the loft, this was the studio, this was the floor area on the first floor. By extending the loft, he was able to obtain all this additional space. Again, I'm not making a value judgment. I'm simply making a judgment of value. I noticed that in the loft area, it had disproportionately low ceilings. And this is where I begin my analysis for valuing on equal spaces. The first thing I noticed was that it had low ceiling heights in the loft space. The first floor was fine, completely fine. We had a lovely fireplace in what was originally the studio apartment, but the upper floors had lower heights. So I had two tasks on my hand. The first was to establish what the adjusted useful floor area would be, or what it was. And then the second task was then to recalculate the market price of the property based on its adjusted useful floor area. This wasn't something that was very difficult to do, and that will be what I'll try to explain as I draw today's session to a conclusion. From my analysis and my calculations, one of the things I discovered was that the adjusted floor area, if you excluded all areas of the building that had a ceiling height of less than 1.5 meters, if you excluded all areas with a ceiling height, floor to ceiling height of less than 1.5 meters, the 65 square meters, which was the overall floor area as advertised by the agent, less areas less than 1.5 meters, this dropped down to 55 square meters. So I lost 10 square meters. Now this is a very important statement to make, because what it means in principle is 15% of the overall floor area was unusable. Well, it was the non-premium space. Of the 55 square meters left, remember, part of it was on the first floor and the other was the loft conversion. 41 square meter was the new loft conversion. So you could say that 75% of the useful floor area was the loft conversion. Automatically that was a red flag, because in principle what that meant was that I had to recalculate the price to make sure I wasn't overpaying for the property. The remaining space, 14 square meter, was the existing studio flat. Interestingly, and this is something to keep in mind, because as we move forward from the subsequent sessions, I'm going to begin an in-depth analysis process for how to value properties. And one of the methodologies I'll be using is what we call the intrinsic valuation approach. The intrinsic valuation approach simply refers to how you estimate the property based on the cash flow the property can generate. This property, when I estimated the cash flow based on its earning potential, the intrinsic value was between 315,000 and 339,000. When I compared the property on a relative basis, comparing it one property to the other, properties in the area sold for between 320 and 350,000. But the property was on the market for 325. So you can see that in principle, it was priced relative to the mean of my intrinsic value. And it was priced roughly relative to the mean of the relative market price. Anyone who had not gone through what I've shared with you today would have been making a wrong, an erroneous conclusion that the price at 325 was a good price. And the reason they would have been making that erroneous decision is that there are two approaches that you should always juxtapose when you're valuing a property that has been converted, or when you're valuing a new property. The first is the intrinsic value, intrinsic valuation, and the second is what we call the replacement cost. So what you hope to do is, if you want to estimate what a property is worth, you compare the intrinsic value and its replacement cost against what we call a comparable cost, or a relative pricing. In this case, that's the relative pricing, or that's the comparable cost approach. I had estimated the intrinsic value. It would have been wrong for me to have bought the property based on the intrinsic value. The reason being, the right approach for this property would have been to estimate the construction cost of the existing studio property and then add to that the cost for the loft extension, and allowing for the contractor's profits and preliminaries. Now, I know at this point in time, I haven't gone through all of the detailed explanations of the methodologies that I use, but please stay with me here and bear with me, because I will cover that in a subsequent session. The point I'm trying to make is, whenever you find a property that has been converted, modified, or if it's a property where you have parts of the building that are not equal, you need to apply a floor area adjustment. And that brings me to the replacement cost approach, because this is how you apply the adjustment. I'm going to introduce my personal equation of how to calculate the replacement cost of a property. This is LEC. Land cost plus building construction cost 1 minus depreciation plus this is the unearned cash flow less, in this case this was a leasehold property, less what we call the leasehold enfranchisement cost, LEC. Again, I'll come back to this formula, so don't worry too much, because in the subsequent session I'll give you the formula in full. That is the formula for calculating the reconstruction or the replacement cost of a property. In other words, what would it cost you to replace or reconstruct the property? In my example, what this meant, or in this property example that I have just shared, I could have simplified this by saying that the adjusted, because this is an extended property, the adjusted construction cost of the property would be the cost of the existing building plus the cost of a new loft conversion. It's very simple. I didn't have to do very detailed or intelligent calculations. I estimated from this formula that it was £5,500 or £5,500 per meter square for the existing. Remember, I told you that the existing part of the building was significantly smaller than the overall floor area. Let me do a calculation just so we can begin. So 65 less 41 will give you 24 square meters. 24 square meters, so this should have been 24. So this is 5,500 times 24 plus the cost of a dry roof dormer. Now, the interesting part of this property was that the loft conversion did not have any wet spaces. The bathroom and the kitchen were on the existing floor, and therefore the cost of the dormer, we call this a dormer. This is a typical dormer construction, a loft dormer. The cost for that was roughly £40,000. The cost for a dry roof dormer, this amounted to £172,000 for the replacement cost. So once I had calculated the costs for the existing building, all I had to do next was estimate the costs for the new loft extension. Let me write down the formula again. What we're looking at here is that the cost of replacing the existing property in its current state. To do that, I began by looking at the floor area breakdown. And if you recall, I said the existing building was one part, and then the property had gone through a process of having planning permission granted, and the loft was converted. So there was a new loft extension. Therefore, the overall breakdown, in this case, the existing building was 24 square meters. The new loft was 41 square meters. I did explain that some parts of the existing, of the new extension had reduced floor to ceiling heights, and that's something to keep in mind. But in any case, I had estimated that the land plus building construction cost was £5,000, £5,500 per square meter. So to do the calculation of the replacement cost, it was quite easy. 5,500 multiplied by 24 square meters plus the cost of a new dry roof dormer. In this case, it was simply a £40,000 cost, and that gave me 172,000. Replacement cost 172,000. But if you recall, I did mention that there was a formula. The formula had a number of parts. We began with the replacement costs formula being the land cost plus the building construction cost multiplied by 1 minus depreciation allowance plus the unearned cash flow less what we call the leasehold enfranchisement cost. This allowance I have estimated already as £172,000. The unearned cash flow is estimated on the basis that there will be a period of construction. If you were replacing a property, just imagine this, you have two properties. One of them you get on day one, which means on day two you can start making free cash flow by renting out the property. All things remaining equal. You have another property. In this case, this second property needs to be constructed similar to the first property. If it takes 2 years to construct the property, then it means that you've foregone 2 years of cash flow. That is what the unearned cash flow represents. It's an opportunity loss, which you have to add back as part of your calculation. And this means, in my estimation, I had estimated that this was a 2-year period. As you can imagine, this is a very generous time frame for such a small amount of work. But nonetheless, I was generous. I said, assume 2 years. This amounted to £22,000. Now, this is the discounted value of the free cash flow that would have been generated had the property been acquired and rented from day 2 over a 2-year period. £22,000. I had made an allowance for the building depreciation of £10,800. Please forgive me, this £172,000, it stops there. It doesn't include the depreciation. That was an error on my part. So I had a depreciation allowance of £10,800, and then I had an allowance for what we call the LEC, the leasehold enfranchisement cost. That amounted to £6,900. Therefore, using this full equation, the replacement cost for the property was £172,000, which is this section, plus the allowance for deducting the depreciation on the building, recognizing that a part of the building was existing and another part of the building was new. So that depreciation needs to be deducted from the overall allowance we've made, which is £172,000. So this is minus 10,800. And then we add the unearned cash flow during the 2-year period of construction, which is £22,000. And then we subtract again the leasehold enfranchisement cost, which is 6,900. And this amounted to 176,300. To make sure you see this in real time, here we go. $172 minus 10,800 plus 22 less 6,900, and this gives us 176,300. That is the replacement cost for the property. Now, if you remember, the property was on the market for 325,000, which means that from my estimation, the replacement cost of the property was far below the market price and also far below the intrinsic value. Anyone who bought the property, which I didn't, anyone who bought the property at this price or more, assuming the market price, they would have been transferring 84.3% of their net worth they would have been paying 84.3% as a premium over the actual replacement cost, and therefore transferring their wealth to the seller. This 84.3 is simply if you were to take the price that the property was being sold for, which is 325, and if you divide that by 176,300 minus 1, that gives you 84.3% as a premium. In other words, that is the actual replacement cost for the property. If you paid 325, then you paid an 84.3% premium on that value, and therefore the difference between 325 and 176,300 was the wealth you transferred, or the wealth the buyer transferred to the seller. On an economical basis, it would have been much, much better for myself, assuming I wanted to purchase the property or property of a similar type. It would have been better for me to find a studio apartment with a loft conversion potential, and once I acquired a studio property, then I can go about obtaining the necessary planning permission, which would then allow me to carry out the loft conversion for the property. That would have been a better deal rather than paying the premium price to get the finished product. So buildings that have been extended or buildings that have been newly constructed need to be appraised with a little more subtlety. The appropriate valuation method for such buildings is the intrinsic valuation approach, but you have to juxtapose that approach with the adjusted replacement cost method. And this is just to ensure that you're not overpaying for the property. Again, I estimated a higher intrinsic value, but the question was not necessarily the intrinsic value in this case, because the building had been modified. You have to default back to ensuring that the price you were paying was less than both the intrinsic value and the adjusted replacement cost. Now, I would imagine this to be something that is slightly, I wouldn't use the word confusing. I would perhaps say it's something that perhaps has got the hairs on the back of your neck standing, because right now you might be thinking, okay, I understand everything that you've said, but the question I have is what price should I pay? Because this is the question most buyers really want answered. They don't really care about all of these calculations and philosophical conversations that I have been making. What they want to know, what you might want to know, and a question you might have in your heart is, what price should I pay? Just tell me what price to pay. From the session we did previously, you would have noticed that, and you may have drawn the conclusion that the price to pay was the market price less all of the repairs. Price to pay. And then today, in this session, and using this example I've provided, I've suggested that the price to pay needs to reflect the adjusted replacement cost whilst looking at the intrinsic value. And I would imagine that there is some element of confusion, but there need not be an element of confusion. The point being that every single building is different. And therefore, you need to bring to your analytical process some tolerance so that you make the necessary adjustment for the uniqueness of the building you have in mind. For some buildings, if it's a new build, and if it's a multi-story building, you might find that there are no repairs needed, and therefore your analysis could be a straightforward one. On the other hand, there are some buildings, and it could be a period building, you might find that you do need to take into account some subtle changes that have been made on the building, just to make sure that you're not transferring your wealth to the seller. And on that basis, the right approach for any building, irrespective of property type, architecture, age, location, geography, the right approach is always for you to pay a price on the basis that you are getting more in value than what you are given in money. That process of establishing what the value of what the property is worth is what we will look into in the next session. And I should say this, that this is where, for me, these conversations start to get a little bit more interesting, because now we can become a little bit more quantitative. So far, a lot of the conversations we've had, perhaps with the exception of this session, has been more qualitative. And what we've been trying to do is combine stories. We've been trying to paint a picture using words. Those words now have to be converted to numbers. So going forward, we will start to look at some of the quantitative approaches to valuation, or estimating what a property is worth. I hope it's been useful, and I want to thank you.